Hey guys, look at what I just got working in DOSBox. That's right, Windows 3.1. Well, technically Windows 3.11, but the difference between the two are not significant to the average person. So as far as I'm concerned, it's Windows 3.1. In any case, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the early versions of Windows are not actually operating systems, but shells from DOS, meaning you still need to have DOS running in order to be able to run Windows. To that end, the earliest versions of Windows before it became a legitimate operating system didn't exactly lend themselves to creating the most technologically advanced games out there, since Windows itself ate up a substantial amount of CPU power and resources, plus had its own way of handling graphics and audio, and as such, it was really difficult to write high-performance applications for it. Plus, the other thing too is that not everybody had Windows, nor did everybody need it or want it, because the only things Windows could really do at first were all productivity and multimedia related. Eventually, the user-friendliness of the thing started to catch on, and Windows did indeed make it easier to produce user-friendly software, especially with programming environments such as Visual Basic, which essentially allowed anyone with even a tiny amount of coding know-how to produce a Windows program. So for all these reasons, the vast majority of Windows games out there are all what's referred to as desktop games, not just because you play them in Windows on the Windows desktop, but because they're typically meant to be played in short sessions as an aside to being productive. And this is why in today's filler, I'm not just looking at one old Windows game, I'm looking at 5, because really, there's very little to say about each of them. But they're all games I grew up playing and I feel are worth taking a look at. And that's not counting the Solitaire game I'm playing right now, because, quite frankly, if you don't know what Windows Solitaire is, then you've either been living under a very big rock, or you only just recently started learning to use a computer. Though I should point out that some of the games I'm looking at today are the shareware versions as opposed to the fully registered versions, since the last time I played these things were all back when I was a child, and as such, I never had the money to register them. Let's start things off with one of the more action-oriented games on our list today, Hyperoid. This is basically a vector-based Asteroids clone written by Edward Hutchins and released in 1991. The goal of each level is to destroy everything, at which point you move on to the next level. Simple enough, though the game has a few features which sets it apart from the typical Asteroid clone. Firstly, you have a couple special abilities you can utilize to make life easier: shields and bombs. Activating a shield makes you invulnerable for a couple seconds, and it can be tricky to effectively use these shields, but it sure beats losing life instead when you do it right. Activating a bomb, on the other hand, does massive damage to everything on the screen, destroying all but the most hardened targets. Bombs can be incredibly useful when the special green mutating space dots come into play, as they will multiply at an alarming rate if you don't deal with them as soon as they appear. The power-ups come in the form of stars, which try to fly into you, but they often appear at the same time as homing weapons, which are shaped like an hourglass. The trick is to destroy the homing weapon, but not accidentally shoot the star, so that you can collect the star and gain its power-up, which varies depending on the color of the star. And yeah, not a lot else to say about this thing, except the vector line graphics look razor sharp when playing this game on a high resolution monitor. Our old Pentium 120 was able to hit 1280 by 1024, which made all the lines in this game look very clearly defined, though they didn't glow like you would expect on an actual vector display. Oh yeah, the game is also extremely difficult, mostly thanks to those homing weapons I mentioned. Plus, it tends to crash if you try to run it on Windows 95 or later systems, so this is a game that's pretty much consigned to run on Windows 3.1. Copies you can find out there now do come with source code though, so the programmers among you could always just try porting it if you really wanted to. Now here's a puzzle game that'll drive some people mad, Klocki. Well, the name is Polish. This game has been played around the world in some form or another for over a century, and it's really hard to know which culture invented it first, or how it propagated beyond. Either way, this particular digital version was developed by the ZH Computer Corporation and released in 1991, though it also found its way into one of the Microsoft Entertainment packs, specifically the third one. The goal of the game is really simple: free the target red block from its prison and return it to the marked area outside. You accomplish this by moving around the other blocks so that you can essentially move the target block closer and closer to the gate. Once all spots on the gate have been marked, you can click and drag on the gate to destroy it, at which point you can move any blocks you want outside of the gate. The game also scores you on how well you do based on how many steps you make, with one step being counted up each time you move a different block. So moving the same block multiple times in a row only counts as a single step. This is another one of those games I find really fun, but also really difficult. However, unlike Hyperoid, this is something you can play in real life with real pieces, as many traditional variants of this game were made out of wooden blocks. Well, the more modern toys based on this theme would typically be made out of plastic. Now, this digital version also ups the ante by having a built-in editor for making your own puzzles. Though, to be honest, the built-in editor is a little clunky and tricky to use. I guess it's not that hard once you get used to its nuances. About the only other thing to say really is that this is another game that looks very sharp and clear at higher resolutions, as the game screen scales appropriately with the window size. So even though I've only got Windows running at 800 by 600 resolution right now, it looks very decent at 1280 by 1024. Oh man, is this game crazy. Jewel Thief is an extremely hard game, but each run through it rarely lasts more than a minute or two, so you can actually play multiple games worth in the stretch of a very short span of time. The game was made by Paul Legeski, and once again was released in 1991. The goal of the game is incredibly simple. Collect all the jewels, avoid all the enemies. Can't get much simpler than that. But where this game excels is its control. Now, unlike most other games like this game is driven by your mouse cursor, which is made to represent the titular Jewel Thief. This means you not only control the game with the mouse, but have the same level of precision and speed you would have when moving the regular mouse cursor around. Now, this game is very aware of this too, since the first few levels are a piece of cake, but the later levels are downright sadistic. There's also a sort of art style going on here that's very appealing despite the low color count, seeing as the game is limited to just the standard Windows 16 color palette. There's two catches when playing this game though that you need to be aware of. The first is that if you touch anything other than the main play area or a jewel, you lose a man, but there's no recovery time either, so you will lose men extremely rapidly if you're not careful. The game will trigger standard Windows beeps each time you take a hit too to help you realize that this is happening. You also need to be wary about the hit detection, since it's often very picky about what counts as a hit and what doesn't. And while this often works to your advantage in dealing with the enemies, it can make it extremely difficult to collect jewels, which are near the edges of the valid playfield area. This is also a good example of what I was talking about earlier. Since each run of this game only lasts a couple minutes at most, it's the perfect thing to play while on a coffee break or waiting for a fax to come in. Basically, any moment where you can't be productive in the office is when games like this would be launched. And while most people's go-to game was Solitaire since it came included with Windows, it was this kind of fast play and simple quality that made games like this stand out and why people bought them in the first place. Now, this isn't to say every desktop game was fast playing, so here's a great example of a long play strategy game, Oil Baron. Made by Al Funk and released in 1992, this is one of the more unique turn-based strategy games that I've ever played, since it's based on the concept of forming oil companies and buying and selling shares in those companies. The goal of the game is to develop a major oil field in competition with other tycoons and to end up having the most money out of everyone else once the field has been completely dominated and no further meaningful expansion can be produced. The game can be played by up to 6 players at once, plus you can also select dumb and smart AI opponents to join the fray. When it's your turn, you first have to do something with one of your chits, spelled C-H-I-T, so no, it's not a swear word. You can either play the chit and place it on the board, or you can discard it, preventing anyone else from ever developing that spot. When 2 or more empty spots on the board join together, it forms a brand new company and the player can select which company to form from a list. And each company has its own initial cost of shares as well as dividends which are provided per share when your turn is over. Once you've placed a chit, you can buy and sell shares to your heart's content until you feel you've invested as best you can and you can end your turn. And each player has their own hand of chits, which means you need to be highly strategic about which ones you play. The reason for this is because if you place a chit next to a company which already exists, you'll expand the company, thus raising the value of its shares and dividends. However, if you connect 2 companies together, they will merge. The company with the higher share value will absorb the company with the lower share value, thus greatly increasing the value of all shares owned by the larger company. However, anyone who had shares in the smaller company will be given the option of selling them off at the pre-merge cost, trading them 2-for-1 into the new company, or keeping them invested in the now defunct company so that the next time it's started up, they'll already have shares in it. Though it's extremely rare for that last option to ever get chosen, since it essentially removes investing power from you, and is only useful when two extremely small companies merge together, and there's plenty of opportunity on the board to reform the company. This is actually a pretty fun game, since it takes a stock market concept and simplifies it in a way that makes it fun and approachable. And even as a teenager, this game made sense to me. There's also tons of options you can adjust, such as how many spaces are on the board, how many chits each player gets. You can set share limits, per turn buying limits, as well as random share values and dividends for each of the fictional oil companies, thus making it more interesting how you invest your money. It's a very neat game, but each play typically lasts a half hour or more, and that's without extra human players taking the reins, so this isn't exactly something you'd sit down and play for a moment during your breaks at the office. The last game I have to show you guys today is another long-playing game, but this one's definitely more action-oriented. Space Exploration Mission Alpha, written by Jeffrey Markin and released in 1992. And that's probably something else you've noticed about these games by now, is that they're pretty much all indie titles. Now, some of them saw publication through third parties, but for the most part, these games were typically written by single individuals, which goes to show just how easy it was to make software on Windows given the right libraries and such. Space Exploration Mission Alpha is essentially a lunar lander clone, with the goal being to touch down safely to score points. However, unlike most lunar lander clones, this one goes above and beyond your typical expectations by having obstacles and hazards on different planets, as well as just having different planets to begin with. Plus, once you've landed, you have the additional goal of redocking with the orbiter that dropped you down in the first place. This is actually the first of 2 games in the series, taking place on planets in our own solar system. Registering the game would get you a copy of Space Exploration Mission Bravo, which took place elsewhere in the universe and offered even more dangers to overcome, like laser weapons and solar flares. Though even this version of the game has its own interesting challenges. On our own planet Earth, you have to dodge aircraft flying through the sky. Well, on Jupiter, since the gravity is so incredibly strong, if you touch down with too much fuel left, the added weight from the samples you pick up will cause your lander to crash the instant it tries to take off, since it'll be too heavy to generate lift versus the amount of gravity there is. Heck, the very last level has you... okay, I kind of don't want to spoil it, but at the same time, it's a really cool way to end the game. And tell you what, stick around after the credits if you want to see how this game ends. Otherwise, just go download it and try it for yourself. And in terms of where to pick all these games up, a lot of them can be found on the shareware websites I've linked you guys to in the past. Download Central has a huge selection, and the selection over at RGB Classic Games is pretty decent too. I'll have links for those 2 places, specifically their Windows 3.1 sections, in the additional info section below this video on my website. In terms of getting Windows 3.1 working in DOSBox, this isn't actually all that hard to do, and there's a guide over on the Vogons forums which will make the process virtually painless. Granted, you'll need an actual copy of Windows 3.1, which never went freeware or anything. Fortunately, it can still be found on places like Amazon and eBay for fairly cheap, provided you don't buy the first copy you see, as some sellers try to gouge people for it. Really though, anything more than $20 and you're spending too much. Heck, if you have any old system restoration discs lying around, you might just be able to use them. The copy I'm running right now came from the System Restore CD from my old 486 Packard Bell system, as it had every Windows disk fully archived and functional. And then it's just a matter of setting up a virtual hard drive in DOSBox and installing Windows into it. Though just remember not to use the root folder of your actual system as the virtual drive, and to set up a special dedicated folder as you would with any game you intend to run in DOSBox. Anywho, that's all for today's filler, so stay tuned for the next episode of Ancient DOS Games, episode 141, coming out Saturday, July 5th. As for which game I'll be covering, it's one of the oldest and most dynamic space exploration games out there, complete with alien communications and landing on planets. Now there's actually a couple games that could be, both of which I have, so you're going to have to trust your instincts when you send in your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see which of those games I decide to look at first.